Hi, everyone. I am very excited to introduce you to Christopher Cozier. Thanks so much, Chris, for being here with us.
Yes, thanks. Good to be here.
You know, we met many years ago, and ever since I've been following your work. I already knew it before we met, but you know, why don't we just jump right in? I think, you know, one of the things that I have always found quite special about your practice as an artist is that you do installations, you do performance, you do video, but throughout all these decades of work, you've always kind of connected that with a beautiful process of drawing and painting, you know, and perhaps the best body of work to discuss that is Tropical Night, which was most recently purchased by MoMA.
You know, in that sort of audience public split that most artists live in, you know, try to reconcile, you know, this notion of how you engage a public, and then of course a specialized audience. But in with my work, I also think about the private and the public. Traditional fine art, excuse the term, practices of which I'm trained in. I went to MICA to learn how to draw and paint. But before I did that, I was thinking of a career more like in design. And, you know, and of course, when you had traditional pre-computer design training, you kind of do a lot of visuals, you know, thumbnails, and so a lot of preparatory things. So what started happening to me is when I returned to the Caribbean, I was really starting to kind of question something about the local convention, and you know, because the move from, say, trying to move into New York in the late 80s and then suddenly finding yourself back in the Caribbean, you know, before internet, before, you know, I actually didn't return to the US for about almost 10 years. I didn't leave the Caribbean, but I started going across to Caracas a lot. And that was when I started to kind of get a first-hand experience of conceptualism in the Latin American context. But I always liked to draw. So a very weird thing happened. I was against making things for delectation, for galleries and display, you know, because that was the pictorialism, the tropical picturesque, all these kinds of weird things that were surrounding me. And I was totally alienated from that and its market and its conversations at home. And I started doing these kind of works, working with craftspeople. And then I started thinking about performativity as well, because with the Latin American encounter, I started thinking about people like Otisika leaving the US, you know, Hammonds and people like that were kind of in my mind. You know, coming out of graduate school, I was kind of defying my good training. And these people were kind of offering me questions and solutions to the problem of working in a place like the Caribbean, you know. But then the technology in that sort of early period, I started doing performance and video things, you know, like Blue Soap. And, you know, I did this thing, Conversation with a Sharjah, which was really a kind of homage to Boys, to Hammonds, to Vito Acconci in a certain kind of way, fusing these concepts. But I was also asking questions about histories. You know, when people think of the Caribbean, inside and outside, they want to kind of embark on a kind of enterprise of historical narration, and they always start from topography, but they don't pay attention to popular culture or things done in street processions. And you know, so I realized that, oh, wait a minute, objects or actions can have equal agency in our context. Since we are rejected by these canonical narratives, then our narrative can start from wherever we want. You know, we don't have to find some topographical painter in the 19th century to say that this is the beginning of our art. It seemed ridiculous. Yeah. So I started with these experiments, but then the technology was difficult. And then I started to realize, wait a minute, I'm doing all of these drawings in these notebooks, all these preparatory things. And then it became a kind of balance between what's more valuable, the notes, the development, you know, or the actual thing that's implemented, because many times it's just an action.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps they helped you distill the idea to create this very powerful poetic imagery. Like one of the first images that just got ingrained in my head of your work was this bread on wheels, right? This loaf of bread that was kind of, and even the camera angle as it is at its level, you know, and it just, as an image, it works as a drawing, but it also works as a beautiful object, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, you mentioned that, because the Tropical Night series was a juncture because there was a curator, and he passed away sadly some years ago, Kevin Powers. He was British, but he kind of moved around Latin America. And I remember he visited my studio in the early 2000s, and we were talking about all these projects, and he kept looking a little bit bored, and then he looked at me and said, "What's that?" And he looked at some notebooks, and he opened them up, and he said, "Chris, I think I want to show this." And I was like, "No, you can't do that. It's too private. It's too personal." And he had some idea for a show that he did somewhere in Madrid or something called People Who Think What They Draw or Draw What They Think. Handing the drawings over to Kevin created a tremendous self-consciousness because suddenly something that was a private zone of reverie and reflection could now be seen, and just the be seen part of it. So I felt I had to contend with that very bluntly and directly. And that's actually how the Tropical Night series took shape. I said, I know people are going to see this. And then there was something else. The work was starting to get some critical attention. And then there were all these kind of stereotypical things. I'm from the Caribbean. So somebody looks, okay, if you're from the Caribbean, then we got to get a quote from Glissant and affix it like a report card to validate the presence of this, enterprise. So I said, you know what, I'm going to try to flush out all of the familiar vocabularies and see if I could arrive at new ones. When it first started, it was like 20 or 30 drawings. I still didn't know where this would go. And it felt very anachronistic, very indulgent, very private, like almost Proustian memory type thing. Get a little bit romantic.
Yeah.
And so I was doubting it. And then I had a strange visit. I saw Hugh Locke in London recently, and he could barely remember, but Hugh came to visit me, and he saw like the first 10 or 15. And he said, "Chris, there's something really creepy going on. I think you should really push this." I was like, what is he seeing? Because I'm still trying to find my way. And then it just evolved, and it turned into a larger series. And I was kind of reconciling myself with some of the drawings are quite beautiful. Some are quite reflective.
Well, and also, something that we have tried to show throughout the series of Art of Mook is how artists do research, but we do a different type of research, and we do very different things with our research, whereas traditional scholars write texts, we make artwork, but also even I consider your body of drawings as a way to do research,
It was
so
an investigation of vocabulary.
Yeah. And sometimes a single drawing or image has a huge amount of complexity. So for example, Afrophilia, this image,
That's
that
one
is
of the,
about a woman and a boat, can you talk a little bit, but it's also a drawing, so can you talk a little bit
all
about
of the
it?
drawings, they carry stories. Because I'm working with popular mythology, I'm working with newspaper articles. And so the Afrophilia was actually a kind of fusion. If you grew up in the Caribbean, the book that ushered us into proper English when we were children was something called the Nelson Reader. And it's a book that kids read 9, 10, you're learning English and learning grammar. And one of the plates is the Ophelia. But what was interesting is around the time that these books are in my imagination, we had this sort of attempted revolution in the late 60s, early 70s. And one group of young people decided that they will not negotiate. So they became like an urban guerrilla group. And sadly, as the pleasures of oil and oil money, you could say people turned their backs on them and the state just wiped these kids out, which is something that's very common at that time in history, late 60s, early 70s, these kinds of movements. So let's say, one of the images that was so strong in my mind as a child growing up was the image of one of these women being shot in the forest and her body resting in the leaves, And so it kind of fused together with the image of Ophelia floating in the water. So the piece is called Afrophilia, but it's really talking about the summary executions of young people at that very pivotal moment, in our development, where you would say nationalism and sovereignty was supposed to protect us from the things that happened, from colonial dispensations, and strictures. But then you think a country as oppressive as Brazil was in the same period, at least someone like Dilma lived to talk about it. But this generation were wiped off. And we thought we were, in some way, a more special place, So in the Tropical Night series, the names, the titles are hints, Afrophilia. She's a kind of a hybrid thing, a little bit like Pam Grier She's got her arms crossed like a kind of Egyptian, sarcophagi. There's a lot of implications, but I don't stand there and talk about it.
Right.
But what I've discovered through this series, when it's shown on a popular level, people read it right away. It's so puzzling. They kind of say, oh, that's about the Jones sisters, right? Wow.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think so much of your work has this level of pleasure, not necessarily joy, but the pleasure in the image, the pleasure in the experience of the artwork. And then there's this sometimes very difficult subject matter that's packed with it, and we have to unpack it. Yeah. How have you dealt with more directly popular, genres like sounds, for example, in your sound system, work? How is that similar there, that there's this kind of heavier subject matter packed into it? Or is there other bodies of work where you just kind of let the pleasure part
play take
over?
I grew up in Trinidad. It's known for calypso, which is a very, there's two kinds of calypso, the popular dance stuff, and then there's the older, more traditional type, which is a lot of political inference and satire and double entendre in the language and so on. So, and actually I listened to a lot of that. Of course, calypso in its traditional form kind of precedes me, because by the time I was coming of age, it was shifting. But then I also was the generation that was exposed to reggae and dancehall. And so I listened to a lot of that, and that is actually the foundation of most of my work. That kind of connection, between popular culture. When I was leaving New York was when hip hop culture was kind of becoming dominant. I saw connections between that, dancehall, and calypso. So what I'm getting at is that the song system really referred to a period in my life growing up when we had this kind of thing called the blockorama, which was, in panyards in different parts of the city, especially in the kind of more grassroots areas. There were DJs, there were popular DJs would play. You went there, there were new dances, new styles. I was very much a middle class kid, but this was a really exciting world. And because I felt sonically space was created just by the bass and the scale and the volume. But you also entered an ideological space because of the content of the music, right? Stories, histories, the moments were captured. So I tried to figure out, how can I respond to that through visual means? And that remained unresolved, in a lot of the work I dealt with. So with the sound system thing, I kind of went into a studio. I grew up with a friend at the time, Robin Foster, who had a thing called the Engine Room. And it was a kind of a place where all the popular musicians used to go back in the day. And I said to Robin, I want you to record something. It was a big joke, because these guys are musicians, musically have no skill at all. But what I was thinking about was the sonic space, apart from the blockorama, just walking around in the city. I still take walks in Port of Spain. So I walk a similar route that I've walked since I was about 8 years old, because I've just been fascinating watching the evolution of the city along the same route. And one of the things about Port of Spain that excites me is that a car will pass and you hear what's playing in the car, So it's the same thing. So the song system, I recorded personal thoughts, my voice, friends, colleagues. Then I shared it with certain musicians. And then I asked cars with big song systems to assemble in a location. And then back then it had CDs. I gave each one a CD so that all had to turn it up. And then it got orchestrated because it's looping on the CDs. And so I kind of created a sonic space, almost like an improvised orchestra. But it was so crazy when I did it in Port of Spain the last time, which was around 2013. Some of these new song systems are ridiculously loud. You could almost use it in a stadium. So it was very distorted, but it was fun. I'm trying to find the connection between sound and the visual. And it had a connection to the Tropical Night sequence of drawings, because in those drawings, it's sequences that are arranged. There's a young Spanish writer that has a book out now, Marta Fernandez Campos, where she sort of makes connections between it and, say, Norbisi Phillips' Zong. But what she's really interested in is poetics and call and response, contrapuntal relations, and that's just really fascinating to me.
And that's also something I love about that analogy between the drawing set and sound
Yeah,
system
it's like,
structure
wow.
is like it's non-linear, right?
No.
You're defying narrative, even going back to this idea of the Caribbean and
Yeah.
that jumping to narrative, you know, and history telling. And there's also another work of yours called Gasman, right? Can you talk about the relationship?
Well, Gasman
Both are
came
playful,
first.
you
Yeah.
know, but they're
Yeah,
quite
Gasman
different.
came first. I mean, because I've started to come to terms with the fact that my drawing books are platforms. And a lot of the projects I do are like staged events where I set these things up to see what would happen. So I was on a residency at Northwestern, and I was walking up and down, looking out at the lake, you know, and some days it would look like a beach in the Caribbean. There's sand, you know, very ironic.
A little bit colder.
Much cooler, you know. And then one day I just had a crazy sort of thought, you know. I grew up watching Chinese, you know, karate and kung fu films, and you know, I think about all the kind of accidents in lakes and suddenly I thought of my own childhood, you know, playing on the beach and watching the horizon. So I was confounded by the location, and I just got this really weird idea. I want to get gas nozzles, and I want to take guys in suits on the beach. And I'd seen this movie, Sonatine, you know, it's a Japanese movie about a bunch of yakuza goofing off, playing pranks on each other before a caper, staying in a beach house or something, you know, something weird like that. But it was funny because at first I went to the theater department to interact, and they were like, gotta workshop this, we gotta do this. But then I come from a society where there's carnival, a long history of improvisation, collaboration. So I just got two guys in the office. I said, do you guys want to go out on the beach with these gas pumps, you know? And they're like, cool, let's do it. You know, I called my daughter. She was in film school in New York. She said, Daddy, I want to see Chicago. I said, well, on one condition, fly. And we all assembled on the beach, you know, right outside the campus on Northwestern. And these guys knew exactly what to do. You know, cowboys and Indians, you know, swinging nozzles. So it suddenly occurred to me that the piece has a number of issues. You know, one, it's talking about the B-movie masculine spectacle. It's talking about multinationals competing over resources, contesting in space. And one thing led to another. Then it evolved into a video installation called The Gasman. You know, it has another fun bit in that it didn't have sound. At first, I thought of just working with natural sound, the wind. And then I had to go home for a wedding or something. I mean, so there's a geography to this production. I go home for a wedding, and there's a young singer at home at the time, had just done a performance, and I saw a snippet online, and I just called them and said, guys, would you all want to meet? You know, so I got a sitarist and this jazz singer, and I projected the raw footage, and they just improvised, and then that became like a soundtrack. And what I realized I was doing was confounding a sense of location, you know, because the music almost sounds like it's Asian. You know, you don't know where you are. These two men could be anywhere, any shore on the planet, any place where sieges and occupation and contestation takes place. So there's allusions to history. I think in a lot of my work, I don't really know why I'm jumping in. The drawings, you know, I'm making a lot of notes. Sometimes the notes are more comprehensive than the actual thing implemented. But once a thing is created and is thrown out into the public domain, then I kind of understand something about what I'm doing. I don't know if that sounds really kind of, I don't know if it's too speculative, but I really enjoy that tension between knowing and not knowing, and this accident that comes through improvisation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also very representative of most of your work, if not all. It's this idea of having a very strong intellectual content, but also not abdicating poetry and defying expectations, right? Of what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do.
I suppose defying some of that graduate school training, you know, that entered into all our practices, especially in the 80s, 70s into the 80s. Yeah. One of the things about living in the Caribbean is that from these societies, you know, from the US or England, there's always this kind of thing that we live on the other side of history, right? However, the Caribbean is the beginning of this whole kind of project. And the more you learn about the Caribbean, the more you realize that it's like we're like a rehearsal for all of this kind of crazy shit that's going on. Like, for example, like, what's the difference between, say, the guy that founded the Wagner Group to go into Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe to grab territory, and say somebody like Sir Walter Raleigh, who was sent by Queen Elizabeth I to grab territory in the Americas. These
the
are
original Wagner Group.
Yeah. So we think we are we're not part of anything, but actually we are part of everything. This is where it all started, all the shit started, so to speak, right? So in my work, when I get invited to do things, I sometimes go into these environments trying to figure out what are the connections, what are the disconnections. So that's when the notebooks became important, and then extrapolated from the notebooks projects, When I went to Sharjah, of course, I was thinking about oil. I mean, all of my recent work, I've been thinking about the relationship between sort of oil economies and kind of violence, internally, excess cash, gangsterism. That's what Mexico, Trinidad, Nigeria all have in common, the blessing of oil and the curse of it at the same time. I try to make sense of these environments. And suddenly this idea of building scaffolding came. And I wanted to build a scaffolding out in the desert. I didn't really know why, but something was bothering me. And then I realized that if the guys working in the museum, most of these guys would enter these societies as construction workers And then, of course, the thematics of the biennial, that section of the biennial, curated by Claire Tancon, referred to Marcus Garvey and this idea of look for me all around you. And Marcus Garvey was radicalized working as a timekeeper for the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica. And Sharjah, and it's a kind of curious environment like in the Emirates where all the people that are there laboring are from a kind of elsewhere. So when I think of the Caribbean in its early era, everybody was from an elsewhere. This was an enterprise, especially from a labor perspective, right? So I built this thing to see what would happen. All the workers were from other parts of the world, from Afghanistan, Sudan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, And while we were constructing it, a bunch of kids from the desert just came and photobombed the whole shoot. And they were very rude. We tried to explain to them we're doing this, and they don't care. So that my shoot was actually destroyed. But I've started to learn working in places like the Caribbean. These are moments of opportunity. So of course I'm thinking I've come all this way, all this money is spent, all this setup. But when I get home and I look at the footage, I realize the arrogance of these young children. There's a strong sense of belonging. They are the people from there. So the difference between people who live there, who own the space, and people like me too, is an imported laborer to build this cultural project, and the workers. So it set up a whole kind of narrative about what the future of these societies would be, because that's what we were like in another time of our history. And you kind of think about the Arab world, particularly the Emirates, the oil-rich countries, and the imported labor. So the piece was called, Elsewhere's Our Beginnings and Endings. We don't know where we're going, Right. So, yeah, but it all really started from scribbling, these lines, just fascinating. And what was weird about it is that when I came home from developing that project, I was digging through some drawings that I had, old drawings that I did almost in my early 20s. And what struck me is I drew construction sites and cranes, because as a young person, Port of Spain was an oil economy and it was a burst of development. So I found a kind of interesting arc,
You also did a project in the Havana Biennial, which is Spanish speaking, but it's a central place how we think the Caribbean, right? The world has had to deal with Cuba for a long time. And so what did you do there? How did you deal with that?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting moment, I think, because as when we first started the conversation, I talked about going to Caracas, and the invitation to show in Havana came in a very funny way. It was one of the first times I participated in a local group event, and the piece was vandalized by an older artists in the country who said, forget it, you'll never be an artist, That kind of the typical kind of old-fashioned, the canon, my work. It was an installation, a wall installation, just like put onto a wall. And it was a work dealing with bureaucracy. I had this brown envelope, that I found from my parents, because they were both civil servants and so on. And then Nelson Herrera Isla, who at the time was one of the curators for the Havana Biennial, just happened to walk in to this show. He was in Trinidad doing some research and saw it and kind of got a little wind of the controversy, that the big boss had said, I will never be an artist. And then he said, well, I got to invite you to Havana. But it was also the time when I had done these weird performances. Like I had a conversation with a guayabera. We talked about art, right? A kind of suit about art, in the homage to Aconchian boys and that kind of thing, and the Hammonds. So then I did this 4-channel video, which was a kind of a video installation, a performance. So it's like the stage for the same kind of accidents that came up later in my career was being platformed. But of course, it's very expensive. I got some support from the French embassy, from local. And it was really my first access to the wider world, because that was the Havana Biennial of '94, special period. You could feel the old ideological rationalizations were kind of fading, and the art market was coming, because that year, I think, would be the year that people like Cacho, people like Los Carpinteros, everybody was now being platformed to the kind of wider world, because everybody was flying in. But I was happy just to have that exposure. I think it was almost like a bandang, non-aligned precursor even to Documenta, to Documenta that I was in, 100 years later, because I met all these people from all over the continent, from all over the world. I met artists from South Africa, because South Africa had recently become independent. So I think I met David Kowani, Willie Bester, people like, I can't remember, I'm not sure if Willie was there, but people like that. But definitely I met David Kowani, who then said to me, you must come to South Africa, which I did some years later under the auspices of the Gasworks in London and Robert Loder and so on, right? And so the Havana was a really significant turning point, because I realized the prospects, in terms of dialogue and exchange, that the Havana Biennial at that moment offered as an alternative to the kind of New York art world, Euro-American model. And so that was a big change. A lot of the more recent works, like say the turbulence piece in the Liverpool Biennial and so on, I had a really fascinating conversation with the team there, because it consists of a couple of drawings, just like Tropical Night, that I sent in a shoebox. It was actually a lunchbox. They were laughing, right? But then I sent instructions for the structures for them to be suspended on. It was just string and shish kebab sticks and wood you could buy in the hardware store, and little eyelets, curtain eyelets. So at first they were trying to come up with all these solid things. But what also happened, because of COVID, the venue kept changing. So the world around the work changed. And so I had to kind of keep working and imagining and locking out the space around, because so the work became like a suspended object, like 3 sails, almost like an armada of some kind, of this notion, because the piece talks about the moment that the silicone bit head goes into the ground and the bullet enters the body, both releasing liquids in the kind of interlocking, crazy story of oil. And then, of course, the rising smoke, because as I said in the beginning, the Caribbean is an old place, right? Smoke was rising in the Caribbean in the late 18th century, early 20th, because sugar was the thing. And, so everything that's happening in the Middle East now was happening to us when we were important. So we've been through it all. And oil is the new addiction, we've been through 3 global addictions, right? Oil, sugar, cocaine, and oil, right? And each one brings a violence, a rampaging to brown bodies, right? And creates the kind of comfortable situations like this, and within which we can have this conversation, ironically, because down there, it's too hot and sweaty. And the struggle is to kind of, how do we transform? How can this awareness lead us somewhere? And it's such a struggle. And we just keep making this work. We keep dreaming, we keep our idealism, because that's what we do. That's the business that we're in. in terms of my own work, I mean, I'm in a very strange place in the sense that there's a kind of itinerancy that I've sort of found myself in, where I'm doing projects in different places, and that has been a great learning exercise for me in terms of just my own capacity, in terms of taking on challenges. You know, when you come from a small place, and when you're a child, you're kind of said you're insignificant, and you're living on the other side of history. It's kind of interesting to kind of go through a process like this, right? I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't really know what an artist was, and by the time I got to art school in the 80s, artist was somebody else. You know, most people thought I was there just to get a green card. The prospect of being an artist wasn't really, you know, as a brown body coming from God knows where. You know, it was a different art world then. Now I think about future generations, so I spend a lot of time talking to young artists and trying to kind of encourage them to take on challenges and not to, you know, fit within the expectations of the environment, the pressures, you know, because of course there's practical things, economics, and then there's other kind of issues about the kind of work you're doing and being confident about it, because obviously we live in a different time, so you have to think about making work in the time that you're living, both formally and conceptually and so on. So it's a struggle to kind of keep that conversation as a norm, because most people don't understand why we're having it or don't think it's useful in a certain way, because they get ushered into rationalizations. In terms of me on a very personal level, I just get excited when I could get into the studio. So the itinerancy is, you know, the moving around, traveling is interesting, but as I get older, I'm saying this in a tricky way, because at one point my studio was where I found myself, because I had drawings were notebook drawings and I would travel. But actually kind of more and more, I just really want to lock off. You know, I came across this weird book years ago. It was Tell Them I Said No. I can't remember the name of the writer, but it was a really funny thing about the negotiations with visibility, right? But I think I'm at my best when I'm in work mode. And even though I work out of the studio by just moving around and doing things, there are these moments of revelry, you know, where I can disappear into my own thoughts. And I'm looking forward to, you know, in a sense, the recent, you know, investment in, you know, an engagement kind of allows me to do that. But I'm always a little afraid of isolation, because, you know, I think all ideas come through engagement and dialogue and exchange. So how to find a balance between the need for exchange, and I don't mean personally only, culturally, and then at the same time to focus. And I think that was really underscored very heavily by the COVID moment, because COVID meant Trinidad had very serious lockdown restrictions on movement, and so we fell off the planet for 2 years. And during that time, what I found is that at first I was anxious, but then I kind of fell into this moment of deep focus and deep reflection. And I'm kind of seeing the result of that now in terms of something about the work. It has an intensity that, I don't want to give up the play. Loved it. Yeah. But I really did feel a difference, a sense of urgency I went into that was very weird. And but I learned a lot, you know, in that moment. And now I want to see if I could, how to, you know, kind of find the balance between interaction and movement, and kind of quiet spaces for reflection.
And, you know, I'm glad you mentioned, you know, your participation in the most recent Documenta 15, curated by Rangrupa, you know, was, you were there physically, but so many of us who were there were in the name of a collective, right? And so I think that's a great way, through this bookend of how Havana worked in those years in '94, and this kind of idea of Lumbung in Documenta, and the echoes, but also the huge differences, right, of visibility and funding. You know, your participation in Documenta was through Alice Yard, right? And so maybe we could talk a little bit towards, you know, for the end of our conversation, about that has been a collective project ever since it started, right? It's in Trinidad, you know, and it's a space of, as I see it, of generosity, of you facilitating and organizing for other artists, not for yourself. And so can you tell us a little bit of how it evolved, how it started, and where it's going?
It's related to two things. There's an architect, Sean Leonard, and I think Sean's practice always involved engaging artists and understanding sort of like the kind of creative imagination and how that impacts, so people create architecture more than architecture imposes itself on people's lives. So I always collaborated, or I got to meet Sean at this point, and we did a couple of things together. But what happened, there was a larger enterprise that happened in Port of Spain in the late 19th, early 2000s, something called CCA7, that generated a lot of attention. But the end result of it, it just created a platform for people like, say, Peter Doig, Chris O'Feely, and others who then were able to come into the island and to buy property because they're part of a global art economy. It's still left to see what else it might have done for the artists living and working there. So with that going on, a group of artists decided they wanted to have an event. It was called Galvanize. There was a young guy that Doig had supported, Mario Lewis. He'd come back to the island, and we put on this event, and that brought Sean Leonard and myself and Nicholas Laughlin, the writer, editor, together to help Mario and to help get this event going. And one of the venues for the event is one artist, a young artist at the time. This is 2006. Jamie Leloy came to me and said, "Chris, I need an old moldy kind of like a garage or something, And I said, "Sean, do you have an idea?" And so she had this thing behind my grandmother's house. I could clean it out. She can do the installation in it, which she proceeded to do. It was very successful. And then the phone started ringing. Is that space available for other video installations? And then some young musicians were having problems where they were living. The neighbors were complaining. Could we use that garage to rehearse? And before you know it, so Alice Yard wasn't something we founded like a business, like an enterprise in an entrepreneurial way. The space was there and people wanted to use it. Sean was busy with his practice, but enjoyed, the activity. So next thing Sean, Nicholas, and myself were meeting. Alice is Sean's great-grandmother, and it was dedicated to her magnanimity. She was a person that supported a lot of artists. And then from 2006 to now, Alice Yard has evolved. Our primary goal is to support, it's like a laboratory, but it's based, people have used all kinds of language to define us: art gallery, alternative space, all of these vocabularies from elsewhere. Yard spaces are central to the human imagination of the Caribbean. It's where carnivals, cultural activities happen, because it comes out of the conditions under which people lived in urban settlements, right? The yard space, collective spaces, collaboration, improvisation, openness. So we were really doing something very traditional. The Caribbean, we are more known for the things we do off-site than the things we do on-site. And in my imagination, on-site is when you're kind of working to build, it's like the plantation. And then off-site is the spaces between industrial labor, spaces of play. And those are the things that define us. All the things that make the Caribbean important are the things that are created off-site in some way. And that's why there's so many laws about idling. And because when you see black bodies at leisure, they might imagine something as opposed to how they register in our minds. And there's a very interesting word that hovers in the Caribbean: are you occupied? What does that really mean? Like occupied in building the Western Project, or occupied in dreaming and imagining some other reality. So we don't really have fixed programs. It's the space is an experiment in improvisation. What was interesting to us is when we met Rand Rupo under the auspices of Documenta, we found so many affinities. They have Lombang. In Trinidad, there's a word gayap, coming from gayapa, that came across from the continent, which has to do with collective, tasks, to build a barn, to cut a field.
In Haiti, it's combit,
There's words like liming, which is what I talked about, off-site. They have non-krong. And so it went, so we discovered tremendous affinities with them. And the whole process has brought about us learning. building community. You know what it is? Make friends, not art. And that's been the process of artists. And if we've ever had challenges, is when people try to label us as things that we are not. You know, so or accuse us of lacking ambition because we don't want to apply for the big grant, or you know. But because the idea is we continue to produce regardless of whether anybody's looking or not, and we continue to produce regardless of whether we have funds or not. It's just been a really interesting adventure. In terms of what it implies in terms of my own practice, well, it has given me, it's like applying something that I'm doing in my own work to a wider sort of social, you know, it's just like an artwork. I think Alistair is like an artwork, but it's one that I do collaboratively with, because there's the four of us now, you know, Sean Leonard, the architect, Nicholas Laughlin, the writer, Kriston Chen, the designer, and then we have a wider field of designers and young artists, both locally and internationally. In fact, we had a very interesting transition now because we've moved to a new property. And I think during the process of Documenta, by transplanting our activities to Casa, one of the things we're asking ourselves is, Alice, a dialogue, a process, or does it have to be cited? You know, even though it's derived from Caribbean experience, but then what is Caribbean experience? Because if 3 people get together in London, Berlin, Toronto, the Caribbean space is in essence conjured by that meeting. Yeah, so yeah, these are the things we're thinking of.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time and for your wonderful work of all these years. It's been
Thanks,
great to
Pedro.
have
It's
you.
been wonderful.